My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'll never forget the day I realized the definition of home could be ripped out from under me in an instant. I had just returned from what should have been the proudest moment of my career, a high-stakes presentation in Manhattan that could change everything for me. My flight landed early that Friday afternoon. The crisp spring air felt like a good omen, and I had a suitcase full of thoughtful gifts for my family. I was practically rehearsing how I'd tell them the good news. But when my rideshare turned the corner onto our quiet street in Denver, I saw it two neat rows of black trash bags, stuffed to bursting, lining the edge of our driveway like grim monuments. My mother stood there in her gardening gloves, arms crossed with my older siblings, Aaron, Melissa, and Josh flanking her like a firing squad. Their expressions were cold, calculated. I stepped out, my suitcase handle slipping from my fingers. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice half hopeful, half terrified. "You're 25, Sarah," my mother said flatly. "It's time for you to get out." The words punched harder than any insult. Just hours earlier, I had been praised by top executives for sealing $1 million campaign deal. Now I was standing on the curb, my life packed into garbage bags, with the people who were supposed to love me most, looking at me like I was a stranger. I searched their faces for some sign of warmth, anything, but found only silent agreement. "You're old enough to be on your own," Aaron added, like this was some moral favor they were doing me. The sting was unbearable. I had lived here to save money to help Mom with errands and bills, to be a support system. And now no warning, no conversation, just eviction in broad daylight. Before I tell you how it all unraveled, and how I turned this betrayal into the strongest chapter of my life, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had someone you love blindside you like this. And if you don't want to miss how this ends, make sure you subscribe so you'll be here when we get to the twist. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest, realizing that whatever home had been, it wasn't here anymore. What I didn't know yet was that this moment, as humiliating and painful as it felt, would be the catalyst for a transformation I never saw coming, and the first step was understanding exactly how we got here. Growing up in our suburban Denver home, I was the youngest of four, the one who arrived after life had already tested everyone else. My father passed away from a sudden heart attack when I was just 6, leaving my mother, Diane, to raise all of us alone. My oldest brother, Aaron, was already 19, practically an adult. Melissa was 17, Josh 15. They had entire albums of memories with dad, family trips, weekend hikes, his corny jokes at the dinner table. I had fragments. A faded baseball cap of his that I kept under my bed, a blurry recollection of him pushing me on a swing. When Dad died, something in my mother shifted. The warm, laughing woman from my earliest years hardened into a figure of pure discipline and control. She worked 2 jobs, reminded us daily of her sacrifices, and measured love in terms of achievement. The phrase, "after everything I've done for you," became the prelude to every command. Aaron followed her blueprint, perfectly law school, prestigious firm, perfect wife. Melissa became a surgeon, Josh an engineer. They bought houses in neighborhoods Mom approved of, married on her timeline, and had children exactly when she said was appropriate. They were the living proof of her parenting success. Then there was me. I didn't rebel, not in the traditional sense, but I took a different path. I studied marketing, joined a growing startup instead of a legacy company, and by 25 I was still single. In my mother's eyes, that made me off script. She'd ask over Sunday dinner, "When are you going to get a real job? Aaron was already making 6 figures at your age." Melissa had bought her first condo by 24. Josh was engaged before he turned 26. Despite the tension, I moved back home after college for practical reasons. My entry-level salary barely covered the basics, and rent in Denver had skyrocketed. Mom told me, "You can stay as long as you need, family supports family." It sounded generous, but the unspoken conditions were always there. I paid her a monthly rent, handled groceries, did most of the cleaning, drove her to appointments, and played tech support whenever she forgot how to use her phone. Around my siblings, I was still the baby. My opinions were treated like the whims of someone who hadn't lived enough to understand the real world. Aaron would say, "You'll see when you've had more life experience," despite the fact that I'd studied abroad and lived independently during college experiences he'd never had. There were moments I'd imagine moving out, but then reality would tighten its grip. Friends my age were sharing apartments, dating freely, traveling on weekends without having to answer to anyone. I envied them, yet I also felt anchored by duty, by financial sense, by the idea that Maybe I could finally earn my mom's approval if I just kept being available. Then came the opportunity that I thought would change everything. Our marketing firm landed a major client, and my creative pitch stood out among the rest. I was chosen to present in Manhattan, a solo business trip, my first big professional milestone. I spent weeks rehearsing, crafting every slide, anticipating every question. The night before my flight, Mom seemed distracted, scrolling on her phone while I nervously chattered about the upcoming presentation. "I'll be back late Friday night," I reminded her. "Fine," she said without looking up. "Melissa and Aaron are bringing the kids over Saturday. Make sure you're here to help." I swallowed the disappointment, telling myself she just didn't show excitement easily. But deep down, I hoped that when I returned with good news, she'd finally be proud. The trip went better than I'd dreamed. The clients approved our $1 million campaign with only minor tweaks. My boss took me out to dinner afterward and hinted at a promotion if the launch went well. "You have real talent, Sarah. I see a big future for you here," he told me. I bought gifts for everyone: a silk scarf for Mom, craft beer for Josh, a monogrammed pen for Melissa, gourmet coffee for Aaron. On the flight home, I imagined their smiles, the teasing questions about when I'd be running the whole company. I pictured Mom telling her friends about her youngest daughter's big win. What I couldn't have imagined was standing on our driveway the next day, staring at garbage bags full of my life and hearing my mother say it was time for me to get out. Before I take you to the moment, it all collapsed. Tell me, have you ever thought you were about to be celebrated, only to be blindsided instead? Share your story below, because I think we've all been there in some way. And stick with me, because the reason behind what happened next will make your jaw drop. What I thought was going to be a weekend of celebration was about to turn into the most public and humiliating betrayal I'd ever faced, and it all unfolded faster than I could catch my breath. From the outside, living at home looked like a safety net. My friends would joke about how nice it must be not to worry about rent or having a landlord breathing down my neck. But the truth was, it wasn't free, and it certainly wasn't easy. Mom had made it clear when I moved back that this wasn't a crash on the couch until you figure things out situation. I paid her a set amount of rent every month, which was more than what I'd have paid for a room in a shared apartment on the cheaper side of town. On top of that, I contributed to groceries, covered most of the utilities, and handled nearly every household chore. Laundry, dishes, vacuuming, mowing the lawn. I was basically the live-in property manager. I also became her chauffeur. Doctor's appointments, church meetings, the grocery store, when she only needed a few things that somehow filled the entire trunk. On tech days, I was her unpaid IT department, spending hours troubleshooting her tablet, her email, and the mysterious ways her phone contacts kept disappearing. And despite all that, there was this constant undercurrent of disapproval. No matter what I did, my career was never a real job in her eyes. She compared my salary to my siblings without hesitation. "Aaron had a down payment for his house at your age," she'd say while I was scrubbing the kitchen counter. Melissa was running her own surgical team. Josh's engineering promotions were another favorite benchmark. I'd remind her calmly at first, then, with growing frustration, that marketing wasn't medicine or law. It was a different track, a different set of milestones. But it never sank in. She measured worth in titles, salaries, and life milestones that matched her own blueprint. Anything outside that template was suspect. The siblings didn't help. In family discussions, my input was treated as cute. Not wrong, just irrelevant. "You'll understand when you've had more experience," Aaron would say with a knowing smile. Melissa would nod sympathetically like she was humoring a child. Josh mostly stayed quiet, but his silence still landed like judgment. And it wasn't just about career. I couldn't even control my social life without scrutiny. Mom wanted to know where I was going with whom and when I'd be back. If I went out on a weeknight, there were comments about how professionals didn't waste their evenings. If I stayed home, I was too much of a hermit to meet someone. It was a lose-lose game, and no matter how I played it, I lost. Privately, I thought about moving out more times than I could count. But then the calculator in my head would start working: rent, utilities, food, gas savings for emergencies. The math never worked in my favor, especially if I wanted to keep paying down my student loans. Living at home felt like the only smart financial choice, even if it meant sacrificing independence. But over time, the trade-off chipped away at me. I began feeling like a guest in my own life, like every decision I made needed to pass an invisible approval test. Even small choices like buying a new coffee maker for myself could spark a lecture about wasting money. The worst part, I kept hoping that by being useful, by showing up, by taking responsibility, I'd earn her respect. That maybe one day she'd stop seeing me as the youngest, the one who needed guidance, and start seeing me as a peer. That day never came. The irony is, I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't out partying, blowing money, or shirking responsibilities. I worked hard, kept my commitments, and lived modestly. But in my family's eyes, I was still the one who hadn't launched properly. Looking back now, I realized that the signs had been there for months. Little hints in conversation offhand, remarks about when you're on your own, or how long do you plan to stay here. I brushed them off, convinced that if Mom truly wanted me gone, she'd sit me down for a serious talk. I had no idea she'd already decided to do it in the most abrupt, humiliating way possible. Have you ever kept giving your all to someone thinking it would eventually be enough, only to realize they'd already written the ending without telling you? Let me know below, because that's exactly what happened to me. At the time, though, I still thought the tide might turn, that the big opportunity I'd just been given at work could be my chance to finally prove myself. I didn't know it yet, but that belief was about to be tested harder than I'd ever imagined. The opportunity came out of nowhere like a lightning strike on a clear day. Our small marketing firm had been fighting tooth and nail to land a national retail brand as a client. And after months of pitches, revisions, and waiting, we finally got the green light for a live presentation in Manhattan. When my manager called me into her office, I thought I was in trouble. Instead, she said, "Sarah, your campaign concept is the one we're moving forward with. You'll be the one presenting to their board." I swear my heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a work trip, this was a career-defining moment. If I nailed this, I could go from just a coordinator to a serious contender for leadership. The weeks leading up to the trip were a blur of preparation. I refined every slide, anticipated every possible question, and practiced my delivery until my voice cracked. I even rehearsed in front of the mirror, adjusting my tone and hand gestures like I was running for office. The night before my flight, I came home buzzing with nervous excitement. Mom was at the kitchen table scrolling on her phone. My presentation's tomorrow morning, I reminded her as I poured myself a glass of water. I'll be back late Friday night. She murmured, not looking up. Then, as if she hadn't heard the weight in my voice, she added, "Melissa and Aaron are bringing the kids over Saturday. Make sure you're here to help with lunch." It was like someone had let the air out of my chest. I'd hoped for a good luck or I'm proud of you, but instead my milestone was treated like background noise to her weekend plans. Still, I smiled and said, "Of course," swallowing the sting. The trip itself was everything I'd dreamed. The board loved my pitch, really loved it. They approved the $1 million campaign on the spot with only minor tweaks. That night, my boss took me to dinner at a little rooftop place overlooking the city. Over wine and steak, she told me, "If this launch goes well, you're looking at a promotion. You've got real leadership instincts." Those words were like water to a plant that had been wilting for years. Someone saw my potential, not compared to anyone else, not through the lens of what I wasn't, but for exactly what I was. The next day, I carved out an hour to shop for gifts: a silk scarf for Mom, artisanal coffee for Aaron, a monogrammed pen for Melissa, craft beer for Josh. They were small tokens, but each one was chosen with care. In my mind, these gifts would be part of a bigger moment, a family gathering where I'd share my success, see their surprise, maybe even hear the words I'd been chasing. "We're proud of you." On the flight home, I imagined the scene over and over. Maybe Aaron would stop teasing me about finding a real job. Maybe Melissa would stop forwarding me job postings from her hospital's admin department. Maybe Mom would tell her friends about how her youngest had just landed the firm's biggest client. When the plane touched down in Denver, the sky was bright and the air felt electric. I texted Mom that I'd landed and was on my way. No response, but that wasn't unusual. She often ignored texts if she was busy. Still, there was a tiny flicker of unease. Halfway home, my phone rang. It was Aaron. He didn't usually call me directly. "Where are you right now?" he asked, his voice clipped. "In the car, almost home." "Why?" "Mom wants to talk to you. We all do. Just get here." His tone was so flat, so formal, that for a split second I wondered if something terrible had happened. A medical emergency. An accident. But when I pulled onto our street and saw the black garbage bags lined up like they were waiting for trash pickup, my life inside them, the truth hit me harder than anything I'd prepared for. Whatever I'd accomplished in Manhattan didn't matter here. Here I was, still the one who hadn't launched. Here my worth wasn't measured in contracts or promotions, but in how closely I matched the mold, and I never had. Have you ever been on the brink of sharing your biggest victory, only to have it erased in an instant? Drop your answer below, because what happened next is proof that sometimes the people you expect to cheer the loudest are the ones who silence you first. I didn't know it yet, but the celebration I'd been picturing on the plane was about to turn into a confrontation I'd replay in my head for months. And it would start with a single sentence from my mother that I'll never forget. When I stepped out of the car that afternoon, suitcase in one hand and gifts in the other, I could feel my pulse in my ears. The rows of black trash bags were unmistakable. They weren't just trash, they were my things. My clothes, my books, the framed photos I kept on my dresser, probably tossed together without a second thought. Mom stood front and center, her posture, stiff jaw set, still wearing her gardening gloves as if she'd just stepped away from pruning the roses. On her left was Aaron casual jeans, and that same expression he wore when he gave bad news to a client. On her right stood Melissa crisp in her business casual slacks and blazer, despite it being Saturday, and Josh in his old university hoodie hands stuffed in his pockets. "What is going on?" I asked, stepping toward them slowly. My voice carried more confusion than anger, at least at first. "Your things are packed," Mom said, her tone flat. "It's time for you to find your own place." I blinked, trying to process. "We never discussed this. Why now?" "You're 25, she replied, as if that was the only explanation needed. "All your siblings were on their own by 23. Aaron nodded. "It's time you learned responsibility." That word responsibility landed like a slap. I'd been paying rent here for 3 years, juggling a full-time job and handling most of the household chores. If that wasn't responsible, I didn't know what was. "This is insane," I said, glancing from one face to another. "I just got back from a business trip. I have nowhere to go tonight." "You should have planned better," Melissa said, checking her watch as though my homelessness was an inconvenience to her schedule. "We all managed to find apartments right after college. With parental co-signing and down payment help," I reminded her, my voice sharpening. "And with higher starting salaries in your fields." Josh shook his head. "Excuses. You've had 3 years to figure this out." My eyes locked on Mom again. "Why now, why today with no warning?" "I've been hinting for months," she said. "Hinting," I repeated. "That's not the same as giving notice. You don't pack someone's things while they're away and ambush them in the front yard." Aaron stepped forward slightly. "Don't raise your voice to Mom." The absurdity hit me all at once. They were lecturing me about respect while standing in front of a driveway full of my possessions stuffed into garbage bags. "What is this really about?" I asked, my tone sharper now. And then it hit me, snippets of overheard conversations about the house property values, the right time to sell. "Are you selling the house?" A flicker of something passed over Mom's face before she schooled it back into neutrality. "My financial decisions are none of your concern." "They are if they make me homeless overnight," I shot back. "You're not homeless," Melissa said in that patronizing voice she used with patience. "You have a job. Get an apartment like everyone else." Without references, without time to save for a deposit, without warning, I could feel my hands trembling. "Do you even hear yourselves? Who treats family this way?" "We're doing this for your own good," Mom insisted. By cutting my legs out from under me. A neighbor walking his dog slowed down to watch, his eyes darting from me to the bags to my family. The humiliation burned. "This is ridiculous," I said, lowering my voice. "Let's go inside and talk about this." "There's nothing to discuss," Mom said. "The decision has been made." Without any input from me, the person most affected, I countered. "Your input has been your continued failure to launch," Josh muttered. That's when Kevin, no Josh, finally shifted his weight, uneasy, the first sign that maybe not everyone was fully comfortable with this. And then, almost under his breath, he said, "She's selling the house." Josh, Melissa hissed. "She deserves to know," he said louder. And just like that, the pieces fell into place. This wasn't about teaching me independence. It was about clearing me out so they could cash in on the sale. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone's good intentions toward you were actually about their own gain? Because standing there, surrounded by my family and those trash bags, I realized that every excuse they'd given was just a cover for something much colder. The revelation didn't make the betrayal hurt less. It just made it feel calculated. And that was the moment I knew, whatever I decided to do next, I couldn't let them control the ending to my story. I stood there in the driveway, staring at the bags and feeling the familiar weight of disbelief turning into a slow, simmering heat. The scarf I'd bought for Mom was still in my suitcase. I'd imagined her opening it with a smile, not tossing it aside like another item for goodwill. My chest tightened, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that every late-night talk, every ride I'd given her to the store, every bill I'd helped pay, had apparently been worth less than a realtor's promise. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice steady now, not because I was calm, but because I'd learned the hard way that showing too much emotion only gave them ammunition. "That's up to you," Mom said, tugging off her gardening gloves. "We've given you enough time to figure life out." Enough time. As if I'd been lounging around avoiding adulthood. My rent payments alone could have been a mortgage in another city. I was saving to get my own place, but not in the middle of a housing market where one-bedroom apartments cost more than half my monthly salary. "You could crash at my place for a few weeks," Josh offered quietly, but Melissa shot him a glare so sharp he looked down at his shoes. "No," Mom cut in. "That's not going to help her learn." Learn. That word clanged in my head. This wasn't a lesson, it was a power play. I bent down, unzipping my suitcase. "Fine. I'll get my essentials and the rest can stay here until I find somewhere to put it." Melissa folded her arms. "No, you take it all today." I straightened slowly. "You really expect me to haul 13 garbage bags in my sedan on the spot?" "That's not our problem," Aaron said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was so thick I could choke on it. "So the plan is to evict me in the middle of the afternoon, without warning force me to find immediate storage, and still pretend this is about my personal growth." Aaron's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "I'm being accurate." We stood there in a standoff, the spring breeze ruffling the plastic bags. My mind was racing, part humiliation, part calculation. The only thing worse than letting them see me break down would be letting them think they'd won. "All right," I said finally. "I'll figure it out." I dragged my suitcase toward the curb, phone in hand. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Who are you calling the sympathy hotline?" I didn't answer. I called Mariah instead, my closest friend since college, the one person who'd seen me through breakups, layoffs, and family drama without judgment. "Hey," I said when she picked up. My voice cracked despite my best effort. "Do you still have that guest room?" "You mean the one that's basically yours already," she replied instantly. "What happened?" "I'll tell you later," I said, glancing at the lineup of faces watching me. "Can I come now?" "You can come yesterday," she said. "I'll clear the closet." I hung up and slid my phone back into my pocket, feeling a tiny spark of relief in the middle of the storm. They could strip me of my address, but not of my connections, not of the people who chose to stay in my life. I turned back to my family. "I'll be gone in an hour. Don't touch anything until then." Mom frowned. "There's no need to be hostile." "No," I said evenly, just honest. "And if you've ever had to pack up your life with an audience rooting for your failure, you know it's not the moving that hurts. It's the knowledge that the people watching could have helped and chose not to." The next 60 minutes were a blur of dragging bags, stuffing my car, and mentally noting what I'd have to leave behind. But with every trip to the curb, the hurt hardened into something else resolve. By the time I slammed my trunk shut, I wasn't thinking about where I'd sleep that night. I was thinking about how to make sure they'd never have this kind of power over me again. And as I drove away without looking back, I knew I'd already taken the first step. Mariah's house sat on the edge of Capitol Hill in Denver, an old Victorian, with creaky floors and tall windows that caught the afternoon light. When I pulled into her driveway, my car was sagging under the weight of 13 garbage bags, a suitcase, and my work tote. The sight of her running down the porch steps, hair pulled into a messy bun, nearly made my throat close. She didn't even ask, just started grabbing bags from my trunk. "You're staying as long as you need," she said, rent-free, no debate. Inside, her spare room looked like something out of a cozy Airbnb listing. Fresh linens, a desk by the window, even a vase of flowers on the dresser. She'd clearly been keeping it ready. I dropped my suitcase on the bed and sat down, my legs suddenly heavy. "What happened?" she asked, standing in the doorway with her arms folded. I told her everything from stepping out of the rideshare to seeing the trash bags to Josh's slip about the house sale. I tried to keep my voice steady, but by the end my words were sharp with anger. Mariah shook her head. "That's not about independence. That's about money." "I know," I said, "and the worst part. They dressed it up like they were doing me a favor." She sat on the edge of the bed. "So what's your plan?" That was the question. My plan had been to save for another 6 months, build up a deposit, and get a place near downtown. Now I had 2 weeks before my work deadlines started stacking, no storage and no official address to put on applications. "I need to get stable," I said. "Fast. And I'm not letting them think I'm crawling back." Mariah smirked. Good, so apartment hunt. Yes, but first, I paused. I think they owe me an explanation. And if they're selling the house behind my back, I want proof. You're thinking confrontation, she asked, eyebrows raised. More like uncovering the truth, I replied. Over the next few days, between work calls and late-night scrolling through apartment listings, I dug. County property records, real estate listings, even casual conversations with a neighbor who was more than willing to gossip. It didn't take long to find the listing for my childhood home, live on a realtor's website with a note seller eager to close quickly. Mariah leaned over my laptop when I showed her. They were probably staging while you were gone, which explains why they wanted me out before I got home, I said. My stomach twisted. Not just because they'd kept it secret, but because the open house date was just a week away. That's when the realization hit me. If they were willing to do this without warning, what else had they decided without telling me? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, thinking about the times I'd believed family loyalty was unshakable. About the Christmas mornings spent in that house, the dinners where we'd laughed until we cried, and how quickly all of it had been redefined by a price tag. I could have stewed in that bitterness forever. But somewhere between one breath and the next, I decided I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I wouldn't be the bitter daughter on the sidelines, I'd be the one who landed on her feet, visibly thriving. The next morning over coffee, I told Mariah my decision. I'm going to show up to the open house. Her eyebrows shot up. Why? To remind them I exist, I said, a wry smile tugging at my lips. And maybe to let the buyers know what kind of family home they're getting. She grinned. Now that's the Sarah I know. Have you ever turned humiliation into fuel? That's where I was sitting in that sunlit kitchen, turning over a betrayal in my hands like a weapon I could use. By the end of the week, I'd signed a short-term lease on a studio not far from work. It was small, overpriced, and barely furnished, but it was mine. And every box I unpacked there felt like one more step away from the control my family had tried to keep over me. The open house was just 3 days away, and I was ready to walk back into that house not as someone they could evict, but as someone who'd already built a life beyond them. The morning of the open house, Denver's spring air had that crisp bite that makes you feel awake before the coffee even hits your system. I dressed deliberately tailored blazer, dark jeans, ankle boots polished to a shine. I wanted to look like someone who had somewhere important to be, not someone who had been thrown out like last week's trash. Mariah offered to come with me, but I told her I needed to do this alone. It wasn't about backup, it was about walking into that house on my own terms. When I pulled up to the curb, I had to laugh under my breath. The lawn was manicured to perfection, every bush trimmed, fresh mulch laid around the flower beds. The for sale sign gleamed in the sun like it had been planted there for months. And through the front windows, I could see people milling about with champagne flutes. I walked in like I belonged there, which in some ways I still did. The smell hit me first, not the scent of Mom's Sunday roast or cinnamon candles, but a staged blend of vanilla and something floral. The furniture was rearranged, my childhood photos replaced by generic black and white cityscapes. It was beautiful in a sterile, impersonal way. Melissa spotted me first. Her eyes widened, and for a second she looked like she might actually greet me. But then she glanced toward Mom, who was deep in conversation with a man in a sharp suit, and her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping toward me. "Touring the property," I said lightly. "Isn't that what open houses are for?" "This isn't appropriate, Sarah." I tilted my head. Neither was throwing me out with zero notice, but here we are. Before she could respond, a couple in their 30s approached, smiling politely. "Do you live here?" the woman asked. "Used to," I replied. "Grew up here. Lots of memories in this place." I let the words hang in the air, then added, "Some good, some less so." Melissa's jaw tightened. "She doesn't live here anymore," she said to the couple, ushering them away. I wandered through the rooms, slowly, my eyes catching on little remnants of the life I'd had here. A faint scratch in the hardwood where we dragged the Christmas tree stand, 1 year a chip in the kitchen counter from when Aaron dropped a pan. They'd polished the surfaces, but the history was still there if you knew where to look. When I reached the backyard, I spotted Mom. She turned as I stepped onto the patio, her smile fading. "Sarah, you need to leave. This isn't the time." "Actually," I said, keeping my voice calm, "this is exactly the time. Because you've avoided telling me the truth for weeks." She blinked, then straightened her shoulders. "The truth is, this house is too much for me to maintain. Selling it is the practical choice." "That's not the part I'm talking about," I said. "The truth is, you made that choice long before you threw me out, and you didn't want me around to see it." For a moment, the mask slipped. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're making a scene. Maybe I'm just making sure the scene is accurate. I could see the realtor glancing our way, clearly uncomfortable. Mom's eyes darted to him, then back to me. Please leave, she said again, her voice low but clipped. I took a step back, lifting my hands in mock surrender. Don't worry, I'm already gone. I walked out the side gate without another word, the cool air hitting my face like a reset button. And here's the thing about moments like that, you don't always get closure. Sometimes you just get clarity, and clarity is enough. By the time I got back to my studio, I felt lighter. The confrontation hadn't changed the outcome, but it had changed me. I wasn't the person they could blindside anymore. I was someone who could look betrayal in the eye and walk away with my head high. That night, as I unpacked another box, I realized something else. The real victory wouldn't come from proving them wrong. It would come from building a life so solid, their approval or lack of it wouldn't matter at all. A week after the open house, I was knee-deep in work deadlines, juggling client calls from my tiny studio, when an email popped up with a subject line that made my pulse spike. Offer accepted. 1437 Willow Creek Drive. That was my childhood address. I clicked it open. The buyers had gone under contract at a price that made my stomach churn more than enough for my mother to walk away comfortable. I stared at the screen, torn between bitterness and a strange sense of detachment. The house was no longer ours, no longer mine, but part of me. Still wanted to know everything about the people who would live there. Would they repaint my old room? Tear out the lilac bush Dad planted before he left? Just as I was lost in thought, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Melissa. Don't contact Mom about the sale. She doesn't want drama. Drama. That was the word she chose, as if being evicted with my life in trash bags was just a minor inconvenience I'd blown out of proportion. I almost deleted the text without replying, but something in me shifted. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me deciding where my energy went. I took a deep breath and opened my camera app. I recorded a short video of myself sitting at my desk saying, "Sometimes closure isn't a conversation, it's a decision. And mine is that I'm done chasing people who don't want me in their life." I posted it to my private social media, not for them to see, but for me to mark the moment. Still, the sale stirred something. I couldn't shake the need to revisit one last time before it became entirely someone else's. So the night before closing, I drove past the house. The for sale sign was gone, the porch light glowing like it had 100 times when I came home late from work. I didn't stop, I didn't need to. That chapter was already closed. Instead, I turned my attention inward. I made a list, literal pen and paper, of things I wanted in this new life. A circle of friends who felt like family, a space I could shape entirely to my taste, and a career that didn't just sustain me financially, but made me feel proud every single day. And if you've ever had a moment where your life pivoted on a single choice, you know this is the point where everything can either fall apart or come together in a way you never imagined. Around that time, Mariah invited me to a networking mixer downtown. "You need to get out of that apartment before you turn into a hermit," she said. I resisted at first, still feeling raw, but finally agreed. The event was held in the rooftop lounge of a new hotel, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. As I mingled drink in hand, I met a woman named Claire who owned a boutique marketing firm. When she heard about my recent pitch win in Manhattan, her eyes lit up. "Funny timing," she said. "I'm looking for a senior strategist to handle some big accounts. You interested in jumping ship?" It was tempting, more money, more creative freedom, but also terrifying. Leaving my stable job for something new felt risky, especially when I'd just been through so much upheaval. But Claire had an energy that made me believe there was something better waiting if I took the leap. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how losing the house had forced me to let go of one version of stability. Maybe that was the point, to make space for something else. By the end of the week, I'd sent her my portfolio. The next few days felt like standing on a cliff edge, wind in my hair, knowing the jump could either be the best or worst decision I'd make this year. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of falling. I was ready to see where I'd land. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Claire's corner office, the Denver skyline glittering behind her. She slid a contract across the desk, salary nearly double what I was making, flexible hours, and the chance to lead national campaigns. "You've got the portfolio and the grit," she said. "But more than that, you've got the story. Clients remember stories. You've turned something messy into something magnetic." Her words caught me off guard. For months I'd been thinking of the eviction as a personal failure, a shame I'd carry quietly. But she saw it as a badge of resilience. I signed the contract on the spot. Walking out of the office, the sun felt warmer, the air lighter. It wasn't just the job, it was the validation. I'd taken hit after hit, and instead of crumbling, I'd built something new. The first few weeks were a blur of client meetings, creative brainstorms, and late-night strategy sessions. Claire wasn't the kind of boss who hovered. She trusted me to run with ideas, and I thrived on the freedom. But success didn't erase the past. Every so often I'd get a stray text from Melissa or Aaron, usually dripping with passive aggression. Must be nice to have all this free time now, or guess you've moved on fast. I didn't bite. I'd learned the hard way that some people don't want reconciliation. They want proof you're still hurting. Then one rainy Thursday, my phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me swipe. Sarah, it's Mom. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Hi, I said cautiously. I heard you got a new job, she said. Claire's niece is in my garden club. She mentioned it. There was a long pause, like she was searching for the right words. I wanted to say, congratulations. I'm glad you're doing well. It was the first kind thing she'd said to me in over a year. Thanks, I replied. My instinct was to fill the silence to bridge the gap, but I didn't. I let the moment hang. I wanted to ask if you'd come by the house. The buyers invited me to see the renovations, and I thought you might want to. She trailed off. I closed my eyes, picturing the lilac bush gone, the kitchen repainted. The truth was, I didn't want to see it. That house wasn't home anymore. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I think I'll pass. Another pause. All right, she said softly. Take care of yourself. When we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at the rain streaking my window. It wasn't reconciliation, not really, but it was a crack in the wall. And sometimes that's all you get, a small sign that maybe in some distant future, things could be different. That weekend, I poured myself into work like never before. We landed a massive account, a travel brand that wanted a nationwide campaign. Claire put me in charge, and I decided to weave something personal into the pitch, the idea that home isn't a place, it's the people and moments that make you feel anchored. When the client signed, I realized I'd just done what my family never managed, turning pain into purpose without bitterness poisoning the result. One night, while walking home under the city lights, Mariah called. So when are you telling your story publicly? What story? I asked, laughing. The one you've been living? The eviction, the rebuild, the whole thing? People need to hear it. I thought about it. For so long I'd been protecting the wound, but maybe now it was a scar, and scars can teach. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew she was right. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was ready to speak. And once I started, I suspected I wouldn't stop. Mariah didn't waste time. Within a week, she'd connected me with a local podcast host who specialized in raw, unfiltered personal stories. The show had a loyal following, people who tuned in because they craved honesty over polish. When the host, a warm but sharp-eyed woman named Dana, invited me to be a guest, I hesitated. Are you sure this isn't just airing dirty laundry? I asked Mariah. She grinned. It's not laundry if it's already out in the rain. This is you taking control of the narrative. The day of the recording, I sat in Dana's cozy, plant-filled studio mic in front of me, headphones snug over my ears. She started with easy questions, where I grew up, what I did for work. But soon she asked the one that made my throat tighten. What happened that day you left your family home? I took a breath. For months, I'd been telling a pared-down version to acquaintances we had differences. I moved out. But here in this space, I decided to tell the whole truth. I spoke about the shock of seeing my belongings in garbage bags, the humiliation of loading them into my car, while neighbors pretended not to watch, the sting of my own mother turning her back without explanation. I told her about the open house confrontation, the job offer from Claire, and the call from Mom that felt like a crack in a frozen lake. Dana didn't interrupt much. When she did, it was to ask questions that dug deeper. What did you learn about yourself? Where did you find the strength to keep going? By the end, I wasn't just recounting events, I was connecting dots I hadn't seen before. I realized the eviction had stripped me of more than just a house. It had forced me to redefine home resilience and worth on my own terms. When the episode aired a week later, my phone exploded with messages. Some were from old college friends I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me they were proud. Others came from strangers, people who'd been cut off by family, who'd survived betrayals that looked eerily like mine. One woman wrote, "Your story made me realize I'm not crazy for walking away from people who keep hurting me. Thank you." I read that line over and over. It was the first time I truly understood the power of sharing, not for validation, but for connection. If you've ever had a moment where you thought your pain was yours alone, imagine what it feels like to realize it's a bridge to someone else's survival. Of course, not all reactions were supportive. A mutual acquaintance texted me, "Your family isn't happy you're telling this stuff publicly." I sat with that for a moment, then replied simply, "I'm not telling it for them." Claire caught wind of the episode too. She called me into her office not to reprimand me, but to say, "This is exactly why you're valuable here. You understand how to connect to people's emotions. That's rare in this business." The podcast opened unexpected doors. A women's networking group invited me to speak at their next event. A local magazine pitched a feature on resilience in the face of betrayal with me as one of the profiles. It was dizzying but also grounding because none of it would have happened if I'd stayed silent. One evening after a long day, I got another text from Mom. Just 2 words heard it. No context, no anger, no apology, just acknowledgement. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I didn't need her blessing to keep talking. Mariah came over that night with takeout and cheap wine. We sat on my floor plates balanced on our knees, and she said, "This is just the beginning, right?" I smiled. Yeah. And for once, I'm not afraid of what comes next. Because the truth was, I'd stopped waiting for someone else to hand me the pen. The story was mine now, and I intended to keep writing it. The women's networking event was held in a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of space with exposed brick walls, strings of warm Edison bulbs overhead, and the faint hum of anticipation in the air. Mariah insisted on coming with me not just as moral support, but because she'd die if she missed my first real speaking engagement. I was slotted as the second-to-last speaker, which gave me plenty of time to watch the others. One woman talked about launching her own business after divorce. Another shared her journey from chronic illness to triathlons. Each story was raw, honest, and magnetic. When it was my turn, I walked to the small stage with my heart in my throat. I wasn't nervous about forgetting my words. I was nervous about feeling them too much. I started with a question, letting my voice carry across the room. How many of you have been told by someone you love that you're too much or not enough and believe them? Hands went up. Heads nodded. That's when I felt the shift, the invisible thread pulling us together. I told them about the eviction, but not as a tragedy. I framed it as a forced transformation, a breaking apart that made room for something better. I shared the messy middle, the nights I sat in my apartment surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, wondering if I'd made a mistake the mornings I fought to get out of bed, but did anyway. And then I talked about the unexpected gifts, meeting Claire, building a career that excited me, finding a community of women who understood without judgment. About halfway through, I slipped in the CTA without breaking flow. If you've ever walked away from a place, a job, or a person, because you knew you deserved more, share that story. Tell a friend, post it online, write it in a journal, because your voice might be the lifeline someone else is waiting for. The applause at the end wasn't polite, it was loud, sustained, and full of that electric energy that says, "We see you." Several women came up afterward, some with tears in their eyes, to say my words had given them courage to take the next step in their own journeys. On the drive home, Mariah looked over at me with a grin. "You realize you've got something bigger brewing here, right? This isn't just one speech." I laughed, but the thought lodged in my mind. Bigger. Maybe even a book. The next week, the local magazine feature came out. My photo, smiling but strong-eyed, was paired with a headline, "She lost her home but found her power." I wasn't sure I liked the melodrama, but the article was fair, and it brought in even more messages from strangers. One stood out. A young man named Alex emailed to say he'd been kicked out by his parents after coming out, and that my story gave him hope he could still build a full, joyful life. I wrote back immediately, telling him I believed in him. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about healing myself anymore. This was about becoming a lighthouse for people still in the storm. But just as things were accelerating, another twist came. Claire called me into her office one afternoon, shutting the door behind her. "We've been approached by a national brand for a campaign," she said. "They specifically asked for you to lead it because they heard you speak at the event." It was the kind of opportunity that could change the trajectory of my career. But it also meant travel, long hours, and stepping into a much bigger spotlight. That night, I sat on my balcony with a mug of tea, watching the city lights blink. The idea thrilled me, but a quiet voice inside whispered a question I couldn't ignore. What if stepping up means inviting the past to come crashing back? I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing: every leap so far had led somewhere I couldn't have predicted. and I had a feeling the next one was going to change everything. I accepted the campaign without hesitation. The brand was a household name in the US, and the project was massive national ad spots, a social media blitz, and a launch event in New York City. It felt like the kind of break people wait their whole careers for. The first strategy meeting was a whirlwind. The client's team flew in from across the country, filling the conference room with the scent of strong coffee and the buzz of too many conversations at once. Claire introduced me as the woman who can make an audience feel, and I caught the approving nods from the brand's executives. We worked late into the night, piecing together a campaign that wasn't just about selling a product, it was about telling a story. And without even realizing it, I began weaving pieces of my own journey into the pitch themes of resilience, reinvention, and finding your place in the world. One afternoon, halfway through the project, I stepped outside for a breath of air. That's when I noticed the text from an unknown number enjoying the spotlight. I froze. The area code was familiar home. I didn't reply, but the message followed me into every meeting, every late-night edit. A few days later, another ping. Funny how you leave out the parts that make you look bad. I showed the messages to Mariah over coffee. She frowned. They want you rattled. Don't give them that satisfaction. She was right, but it was harder than it sounded. Every time my name popped up in a news article or on the brand's social media, I wondered if they were watching, twisting my words. Still, the work was too important to let fear steer. When the client approved the final campaign, they asked me to speak at the New York launch. I knew this was my open-loop moment, the one that would leave the audience hanging on for what came next. At the launch, I stood under the bright stage lights, a massive screen behind me playing the ad we'd built. The crowd was a mix of industry insiders, journalists, and influencers, all waiting for me to say something memorable. I leaned into the mic. We live in a world where the places we come from don't always define the places we're going. Sometimes leaving isn't about running away, it's about stepping into the life you were meant to live. It wasn't part of the prepared remarks, but it landed. I could feel the room shift, the subtle hum of people catching the deeper meaning. Afterward, the client's CEO shook my hand, saying, "That line, keep it. It's pure gold." But not everyone was clapping. Later that night, back in my hotel room, another message appeared. "You think words make you untouchable? We know the truth." I stared at the screen for a long time before locking my phone. That's the thing about chasing the life you want, you never fully outrun the ghosts. But as I looked out over the glittering Manhattan skyline, I realized something important. Ghosts only have power if you keep the lights off. And I was just getting started turning them on. The next morning, my inbox was full press requests, collaboration offers, even a speaking invitation from a leadership conference in Chicago. The campaign was being called one of the most emotionally engaging launches of the year. Claire beamed at me in the airport lounge. "You're not just in demand," she said. "You're becoming the demand." I smiled, though inside I was still wrestling with the shadow of those texts. But maybe the only way to shrink a shadow is to keep walking forward, letting the light stretch ahead. Something told me the people sending those messages weren't done, but neither was I. And if they thought they could scare me back into silence, they were about to learn they'd underestimated just how far I was willing to go. The leadership conference in Chicago was unlike anything I'd ever attended. 3 days of back-to-back panels, keynote speeches, and networking events, an ocean of ambition in tailored suits and name badges. My session was scheduled for the final afternoon, right before the closing remarks, which meant one of two things: either people would be too tired to care, or they'd be hungry for one last spark before heading home. I planned for the latter. The theme was turning setbacks into springboards, and I knew exactly how to make it resonate. But when I stepped onto that stage, the sea of expectant faces reminded me of something I hadn't felt in months, a twinge of stage fright. I started with a pause, not a nervous pause, but the deliberate kind that makes people lean in. Then I said, "The day I was kicked out of my family home, I thought my life was ending. But here's the thing. Sometimes the ending you fear is just the prologue to the story you were meant to write." A murmur moved through the crowd, the kind you hear when something clicks. I talked them through the journey, not just the events, but the emotions, the confusion, the shame, the stubborn decision to stand tall anyway, and then the turn how each small act of rebuilding became a step toward a life I didn't even know I wanted. Halfway through, I gave them a CTA that fit seamlessly into the story. If you're sitting here with a failure on your shoulders, ask yourself, what if this isn't the weight holding you down, but the push you need to jump higher? And when you've made that leap, tell the story. Pass the torch. Someone else needs your light. Heads nodded. People scribbled notes. One man in the front row actually mouthed, "Thank you." After my talk, I barely made it off the stage before a small group surrounded me. Executives, entrepreneurs, a couple of recent graduates who looked like they'd just been handed a map to somewhere they didn't think existed. They thanked me not for the inspiration, but for making it real. That night alone in my hotel room, I found another text from the same unknown number. "Stop pretending you're a hero. We remember who you are." I stared at it, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Not from fear this time, but from a slow simmering anger. I typed back, "You don't get to write my story anymore." And then I blocked the number. It was a small act, but it felt like cutting the last thread tying me to a version of myself I no longer recognized. The next morning, I met Claire and Mariah for breakfast. Over coffee, Claire said, "You could build a whole brand around this speaking, writing, maybe even coaching. You've got momentum, and people want more of what you have." The idea didn't feel far-fetched anymore. It felt inevitable. By the time my plane touched down back home, I'd made a decision. I wasn't just going to keep telling my story, I was going to teach others how to find the courage to tell theirs. And for the first time since the day I stood in my driveway with garbage bags at my feet, I realized I didn't just have my life back. I had built a new one. One that no one, not family, not strangers, not ghosts, could take from me. The twist was still coming. I could feel it like the shift in the air before a storm. But now I wasn't bracing for impact. I was ready to meet it head on. The storm arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk finalizing a proposal for a new client when Claire called. Her voice was tight, the kind of tone that made my stomach drop before she even said the words. "Someone's leaked a story about you," she said. "It's on a blog that thrives on scandal. They're framing it like you abandoned your family, made up your hardships for attention." For a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I clicked the link she sent, and there it was. Paragraph after paragraph, twisting half-truths into daggers. Old photos of me, headlines designed to inflame, and worst of all, comments from people who claimed to know me. It wasn't just my reputation on the line. This could scare away clients, derail the momentum I'd been building. I called Mariah. She didn't bother with hello. "We knew something like this might happen," she said. "So what's the plan? Hide or fight?" I knew my answer before she finished speaking. That evening, instead of staying silent, I went live on my social media. Not to defend myself point by point, that would only feed the fire, but to tell the story again in my own words. I spoke calmly, but with conviction. "The truth is messy," I said. "It's not neat, it's not always flattering. But it's mine, and I won't let anyone else hold the pen." I didn't attack, didn't name names. I just laid it out, how losing my home had forced me to rebuild, how I had made mistakes, but also made amends, how my story wasn't about shame, but about survival. The comments poured in, hundreds within minutes. People thanked me for being honest. Others shared their own experiences with family betrayal, evictions, starting over. The tide shifted. The narrative was no longer being written by strangers behind keyboards. It was being carried by a community I'd built through truth. The next day, a national morning show producer called. They wanted me to come on and talk about owning your narrative in the face of public attack. It was the kind of exposure that could bury the scandal and elevate the message. I said yes. On set, under the studio lights, the host asked, "What would you say to someone who feels like their story has been taken from them?" I leaned forward, meeting the camera's gaze. "Take it back. Tell it loud. Tell it messy. Tell it before someone else twists it into something you don't recognize. Because your story is the one thing that is truly yours. Guard it, share it, live it." When the segment aired, my inbox flooded again, not with hate this time, but with gratitude. Bookstores reached out about signings. A podcast wanted to do a series on resilience featuring me as the anchor guest. And then came the email from a woman named Danielle. She was estranged from her family after refusing to cover up her brother's fraud. She wrote, "Your courage gave me permission to stop apologizing for protecting myself." I sat with that line for a long time. It was the clearest reminder yet of why I'd chosen to keep speaking even when my voice shook. CTA. If you've ever been silenced, I hope you'll take this as your sign to speak. Your story might be the reason someone else finds the strength to stand. Looking out my apartment window that night, city lights scattered across the skyline, I realized the scandal hadn't destroyed me. It had solidified me. The fear of losing everything again no longer held power because I'd learned something unshakable. You can't cancel someone who refuses to disappear. And as for the ghosts in my past, they'd have to watch as I turned every attempt to break me into another step forward. From here, the only direction was ahead, toward new stages, new faces, and new stories waiting to be told. Life after the storm didn't quiet down, it simply shifted into a steadier rhythm. The media requests slowed, the whispers faded, and what remained was the work I had built from scratch. My calendar filled with speaking engagements, mentoring sessions, and the occasional brand campaign, but there was space, now space to breathe, to think, to just be. I started spending my weekends in ways that fed my soul. Saturday mornings meant coffee at the little corner cafe where the barista knew my order before I spoke. Afternoons were often spent in the park watching strangers walk dogs or teaching their kids to ride bikes. There was something grounding about those ordinary moments. They reminded me that I wasn't just a headline or a cautionary tale or even a comeback story. I was simply living. One crisp autumn morning, I took a long walk along the river. The trees were a riot of gold and crimson, their leaves drifting into the water like tiny ships setting out on new journeys. I thought about how not long ago I'd been so tangled in fear and anger that I couldn't see beyond the next battle. Now I understood that survival was only the first chapter. The rest was about building a life that felt worth protecting. I kept in touch with Danielle, the woman who had emailed me after my TV interview. She'd found her footing again, started a small business, reconnected with friends she'd lost touch with. One day she said, "It's strange, but I don't think I'd change what happened. Without it, I wouldn't be who I am now." I knew exactly what she meant. The truth is, I'll always carry the scars. The ghosts might still linger at the edges, but they don't define me anymore. The power they once held has dissolved into something I can carry without breaking. And here's what I've learned. Freedom isn't the absence of pain or the guarantee of safety. It's the choice to keep moving forward, even when the road behind you is littered with broken trust. It's the quiet courage to speak your truth, even when your voice trembles. So I'll keep telling my story, not because I need the world to remember it, but because somewhere out there is someone standing in their driveway with a bag of broken pieces wondering if they can make it through. I want them to know they can. And if they ever doubt it, I'll be here lights on ready to remind them. The past doesn't get to write the ending. We do.